Well, radical left-wing governments may have been elected in the UK and France at the weekend, but they owe their success in large part due to a revolt by mainstream voters where there has been a fracturing on the centre-right. UK Labor's Sir Keir Starmer won a record number of seats but only secured 34% of the overall vote in an election with a turnout of just 59% of eligible voters. Remember, the UK voting is not compulsory. Now, this means that with more than 40% of voters so fed up with politics or simply too lazy that they didn't turn up to vote, more than 40% of those who did vote voted for parties other than the dominant Labor or Conservatives. They voted for parties like Nigel Farage's Reform, which secured 5 seats. Across the English Channel in France, where the French President Emmanuel Macron, spooked by the big gains of Conservatives at the European Parliament elections recently, called a snap election. This almost backfired spectacularly for him, and it was only through tactical voting and manoeuvring by the radical left that stopped the surging Marine Le Pen and her national rally from taking control of the French Parliament. Now, joining me to make sense of all this and to work out what lessons there are for Australia's Conservative parties, here is fellow ADH TV host and Spectator Australia Flat White editor Alexandra Marshall. Ellie, thanks so much for your time. Let's look at the UK situation first. Is it not the case that Labor's Sir Keir Starmer didn't so much win the election, but that the Conservatives handed him government by their abandoning of their conservative principles?
Yes, and it's important to remember, Lyle, that although not everyone voted for Labor, the reverse of that vote was not entirely Conservative either. There are a lot of Liberal Democrats in there, there were the Greens, there were Islamic independents. So it wasn't as if Nigel Farage gifted Labor the election, but you are totally correct to say that a civil war, essentially, on the right has been causing issues with its election turnout. Now, with the Tories, they were given plenty of warning that this was going to happen. I mean, they've had how many prime ministers in a short period of time?
5.
Yeah, exactly. It's a complete joke. And what do? They elected a globalist to lead them into the election, and then they're wondering why the Conservatives didn't vote for them.
Well, let's have a look at some of what the Conservatives have done that's caused them to fail. I think this is encapsulated brilliantly in a quote from the former UK Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, of the Conservative, the previous Conservative administration. She said this. She said, quote, "We failed to cut immigration or tax or to deal with the net zero and woke policies we have presided over for the past 14 years, end quote. Now, Ellie, the same could be said about the Liberals here in Australia under Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison.
It's like they're a pack of little school kids and they've all been passing notes to each other for the exam, but really bad notes because the kid who wrote them had no idea what they were doing. But so Braverman is completely correct about immigration being one of these examples where Conservatives have completely failed. And interesting, Keir Starmer has come out straight away within, 48 hours and decided to make stopping mass migration one of his key issues, much to the confusion of those who voted for him. But it's seen as a way of trying to win over those lingering Tory voters and keeping them inside the Labor fold. So the Tories were afraid to do anything useful for fear of the press and fear of the backlash. And yet here's Labor doing exactly what they call racist if the Tories had done it.
Yeah, that's right. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Nigel Farage and whether he played a wrecking role. And it's been, the figures from the voting show that if the Conservative vote and the Reform vote was combined, that a Conservative government could have been elected. But the reality is, as Braverman has said, the Conservatives haven't been governing as Conservatives. So is it not the case that perhaps they might as well have a Labor government so the Conservatives can regroup and try and work out who they are? And I think that's what Farage's tactic is.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that because it's not just Tories plus Reform against Labor. If you were having preference voting, it'd be Labor plus Greens plus Independents plus Liberal Democrats against Tory and Reform. So they might have struggled there as well. But you're right. Like someone like Farage doesn't appear out of the wilderness for no reason at all. He's there filling a void because, as you say, the Conservatives have failed to be Conservatives, and they can't keep saying, oh, if you vote for Reform, you're betraying the Conservative cause. this party, this movement, conservatism as a whole, clearly needs to have its own revolution or restoration, whatever you want to call it, before it is fit to govern. And someone like Farage is necessary to force, even if it's just an outside influence, forcing the Tories to go and look at themselves in the mirror and say, what are my first principles? What do I believe in as a party? And only when they have some clear direction, because Labor's got direction. It's a bad direction, but it's a direction. When Conservatives know what they're doing, people will vote for them again. And that's why someone like Farage is important to the party, even if he had a vote-splitting effect this time around.
Yeah, OK. Now, well, let's have a look at, I guess, across the channel in France. You had Marine Le Pen. Now, she was running on a platform that was concerned about the Islamic immigration. We'll come to the situation here in Australia in a moment. But she was called a Nazi. The pejorative far right was always used in mainstream papers, even like The Australian, which I consider a reasonably conservative paper here in Australia. This is an unfair smear and demonisation of people who are simply expressing mainstream concerns.
It's pretty bizarre to call Marine Le Pen far right, given she's effectively a socialist that doesn't like mass migration. I mean, the French are pretty left-wing in general, so even their quote-unquote far right are sitting so far to the left of someone like Anthony Albanese, we would not recognise them as conservatives. But her main thing has been the destruction of French culture by the rise of Islam. And let's not forget that although France has a lot of religious history, it currently considers itself to be a secular state after their revolution, and the rise of a authoritative Islamic state that's happening inside France is a real worry to so many people who are there. And so when she says things like in her speech, we are going to make sure that radical imams are shut down and mosques that are teaching terrorism are shut down, anyone who's here who hates France will be deported, that's a pretty mainstream view in most of France. But the problem is all the really radical left united against her. So now, instead of the country getting a more conservative view or French-centric view about their nation, they've got an alliance between communists, socialists and Greens, which is one of the most frightening things of all time.
It sure is, and we're heading in a similar direction here, potentially in Australia. Last week we saw pro-Hamas protesters, and that's what I'm going to call them. They are pro-Hamas protesters. They stormed our capital and desecrated the seat of Australian democracy, unfurling terrible banners above our Parliament House. Our war memorials were also desecrated. Now, Ellie, why does our media not respond with the same outrage as it did when Trump supporters in the US protested at the US Capitol back in 2020?
I have a better question, not about our media, but why don't our police investigate and arrest and pursue these crimes against those? Because the media would be forced to report on them if they did, and they might be more inclined to report on these things happening if the police actually did their job. We don't know anything further about what happened at Parliament House. We know someone helped them, but we don't know who. We know they violated all these laws, but we're not being told what's going to happen to them. We don't even know who they are. All the statues, we have the Captain Cook statues cut off at the ankles. We've heard nothing more about that. We even had people uploading their crimes to social media, and the police are like, sorry, we don't know. We've got no idea. And yet they door knock pregnant women during COVID. There is something wrong with how we police, and that is the most important thing we have to fix first. And then the media can report on that, and maybe they'll correct themselves. We have to start with our laws and making sure they're enforced.
Couldn't agree more. Anthony Albanese, again, chasing his tail behind the 8 ball, this week announced a special envoy on anti-Semitism. But in order to, I guess, play to the Western Sydney Muslim vote, the Melbourne Muslim vote, he also announced that he's going to soon announce a special envoy to combat Islamophobia, even though there's no one preaching hatred and violence against Muslims in churches or synagogues, but plenty of imams are preaching with impunity hatred and violence against Jews. Now, you tweeted this week that you were afraid of Islam. Now, like you, I'm afraid of an Australian Islam that openly backs Hamas and which opens up its mosques and Islamic centres to hate preachers. Does this make us Islamophobes?
Well, Islamophobia is not a made-up fear, it's a real fear. Like, I'm afraid of huntsman spiders. That's not a phobia, it's a genuine and quite validated fear. As a woman, you would be terrified of Islam because look at Islamic-governed nations. Women from the West would never live there, and for good reason. And why should we turn our beautiful country into a place where women are afraid to walk the streets? Not just women, but LGBTQ plus whatever people are not safe in an Islamic country either. But what I want to know from Albanese is, where is our envoy to protect Australian culture?
Yep.
It's Australian culture that's being attacked and destroyed quite physically and quite literally in daylight, and yet we've got no one doing anything about it. And I do not want to see sectarian politics in our parliament, and electing an envoy for any religion is an absolutely dreadful idea. We shouldn't have one for the Jewish faith. We shouldn't have one for the Islamic faith. We shouldn't have an envoy for any faith in our parliament. What we should have is someone cracking down on the breaking of laws and these protesters who get out there and violate our laws and make everyone's life a misery under the banner of, oh, you know, Free Palestine or whatever they're up to this week.
Couldn't agree more, Alexandra. I'd encourage everyone to go to The Spectator to watch Spectator TV and to catch up with your analysis. Appreciate you giving your time today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Lyle.